Let us resume reading the No Side of the Abolition of Torture on page 356. Remember, in the war on terrorism, we have already detained and even killed many innocents. Pentagon reports have acknowledged that up to 90% of the prisoners at Abu Ghraib, many of whom were abused and tortured, were not guilty of anything. But let us assume for the sake of argument that all of Krauthammer's conditions apply. Do we have the right to torture our hypothetical detainee? According to Krauthammer, of course we do. No responsible public official put in that position would refuse to sanction torture if he believed it would save thousands of lives. And if it's necessary, Krauthammer argues, it should be made legal. If you have conceded that torture may be justified in one case, Krauthammer believes you have conceded that it may be justified in many more. In his words, once you've established the principle, to paraphrase George Bernard Shaw, all that's left to haggle about is the price. But this is too easy and too glib a formulation. It is possible to concede that in an extremely rare circumstance, torture may be used without conceding that it should be legalized. One imperfect but instructive analogy is civil disobedience. In that case, laws are indeed broken, but that does not establish that the laws should be broken. In fact, civil disobedience implies precisely that laws should not be broken, and protesters who engage in it or present themselves promptly for imprisonment and legal sanctions on exactly those grounds. They do so for demonstrative purposes. They are not saying that laws don't matter. They are saying that laws do matter, that they should be enforced, but that their conscience in this instance demands that they disobey them. In extremis, a rough parallel can be drawn for a president faced with the kind of horrendous decisions on which Krauthammer rests his entire case. What should a president do? The answer is simple. He may have to break the law. In the Krauthammer scenario, a president might well decide that if the survival of the nation is at stake, he must make an exception. At the same time, he must subject himself, and so must those assigned to conduct the torture, to the consequences of an illegal act. Those guilty of torturing another human being must be punished or pardoned ex post facto. If the torture is revealed to be useless, if the tortured man is shown to have been innocent or ignorant of the information he was tortured to reveal, then those responsible must face the full brunt of the law for, in Krauthammer's words, such a terrible and monstrous thing. In Michael Walzer's formulation, if we are to have dirty hands, it is essential that we show them to be dirty. What Krauthammer is proposing, however, is not this compromise, which allows us to retain our soul as a free republic while protecting us from catastrophe in an extremely rare case. He is proposing something very different, that our dirty hands be wiped legally clean before and after the fact. That is a Rubicon we should not cross, because it marks the boundary between a free country and an unfree one. Krauthammer, moreover, misses a key lesson learned these past few years. What the hundreds of abuses and torture incidents have shown is that once you permit torture for someone somewhere, it has a habit of spreading. Remember that torture was originally sanctioned in administration memos only for use against illegal combatants in rare cases. Within months of that decision, abuse and torture had become endemic throughout Iraq, a theater of war in which even Bush officials agree that Geneva Conventions apply. The extremely coercive interrogation tactics used at Guantanamo Bay migrated to Abu Ghraib. In fact, General Jeffrey Miller was sent to Abu Ghraib specifically to replicate Guantanamo's techniques. According to former Brigadier General Janis Karpinski, who had original responsibility for the prison, Miller ordered her to treat all detainees like dogs. When Captain Ian Fishback, a West Point graduate and member of the 82nd Airborne, witnessed routine beatings and abuse of detainees at detention centers in Iraq and Afghanistan, often for sport, he tried to stop it. It took him a year and a half to get any response from the military command, and he had to go to Senator John McCain to make his case. In short, what was originally supposed to be safe sanctioned and rare, became endemic, disorganized, and brutal. The lesson is that it is impossible to quarantine torture in a hermetic box. It will inevitably contaminate the military as a whole. Once you have declared that some enemies are subhuman, you have told every soldier that every potential detainee he comes across might be exactly that kind of a prisoner, and that anything can be therefore done to him. That is what the disgrace at Abu Ghraib proved, and Abu Ghraib produced a tiny fraction of the number of abuse, torture, and murder cases that have been subsequently revealed. The only way to control torture is to ban it outright, everywhere. Even then, in wartime, some bad apples will always commit abuse, but at least we will have done all we can to constrain it. Krauthammer's second case for torture is equally unpersuasive. For slow-fused detainees, high-level prisoners like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, with potentially, if not immediately, useful information. Krauthammer again takes the most extreme case and uses it to establish a general rule. He concedes that torture, according to almost every careful student and expert, yields highly unreliable information. Anyone can see that. If you are screaming for relief after a few seconds of waterboarding, you're likely to tell your captors anything, true or untrue, to stop the agony and terror. But Krauthammer then argues that unless you can prove that the torture never works, it should always be retained as an option. And he quotes him here, "It may indeed be true that torture is not a reliable tool," Krauthammer argues, "but that is very different from saying that it is never useful. And if it cannot be deemed always useful, it must be permitted even when an imminent threat is not in the picture." The problem here is an obvious one. You have made the extreme exception the basis of a new rule. You have said that if you cannot absolutely rule out torture as effective in every case, it should be ruled in as an option for many. Moreover, if allowing torture even in the ticking time bomb scenario makes the migration of torture throughout the military likely, this loophole blows the doors wide open. And how do we tell good intelligence from bad intelligence in such torture-infested interrogation? The short answer is we cannot. By allowing torture for slow-fused detainees, you sacrifice a vital principle for intelligence that is uniformly corrupt at best and useless at worst. In fact, the use of torture and coercive interrogation by U.S. forces in this war may have contributed to a profound worsening of our actionable intelligence. The key to intelligence in Iraq, and indeed in Muslim enclaves in the West, is gaining the support and trust of those who give terrorists cover, but who are not terrorists themselves. We need human intelligence from Muslims and Arabs prepared to spy on them and inform on their neighbors and friends and even family and tribe members. The only way they will do that is if they perceive the gains of American intervention is greater than the costs. If they see clearly that cooperating with the West will lead to a better life and a freer world rather than more of the same. What our practical endorsement of torture has done is to remove that clear boundary between the Islamists and the West and made the two equivalent in the Muslim mind. Saddam Hussein used Abu Ghraib to torture innocents, and so did the Americans. Yes, what Saddam did was exponentially worse, but in doing what we did, we blurred the critical bright line between the Arab past and what we are proposing as the Arab future. We gave al-Qaeda an enormous propaganda coup, as we have done with Guantanamo and Bagram and the salt pit torture chambers in Afghanistan and the secret torture sites in Eastern Europe. In World War II, American soldiers were often tortured by the Japanese when captured, but Franklin Roosevelt refused to reciprocate. Why? Because he knew that the goal of the war was not just Japan's defeat, but Japan's transformation into a democracy. He knew that if the beacon of democracy, the United States of America, had succumbed to the hallmark of totalitarianism, then the chance of democratization would be deeply compromised in the wake of victory. No one should ever underestimate the profound impact that the conduct of American troops in World War II had on the citizens of the eventually defeated Axis powers. Germans saw the difference between being liberated by the Anglo-Americans and being liberated by the Red Army or the Russians. If you saw an American or British uniform, you were safe. If you didn't, the terror would continue, just in a different way. Ask any German or Japanese of the generation that built democracy in those countries, and they will remind you of American values, not trumpeted by presidents in front of hand-picked audiences, but demonstrated by the conduct of U.S. military during occupation. I grew up in Great Britain, a country with similar memories. In the dark days of the Cold War, I was taught that America, for all its faults, was still America, and that America did not constitutively, could not torture anyone. If American conduct was important in Germany and Japan, how much more important is it in Iraq and Afghanistan? The entire point of the war on terrorism, according to the president, is to advance freedom and democracy in the Arab world. In Iraq, we had a chance not just to tell how to show the Iraqi not just to tell, but to show the Iraqi people how democracy acts. And tragically, in one critical respect, we failed. That failure undoubtedly contributed to the increased legitimacy of the insurgency and illegitimacy of the occupation, and it made collaboration between informed Sunnis and the U.S. forces far less likely. What minuscule intelligence we might have plausibly gained from torturing and abusing detainees is vastly outweighed by the intelligence we have forfeited by alienating many otherwise sympathetic Iraqis and Afghans. By deepening the divide between by deepening the divide between the democracies and by sullying the West's reputation in the Middle East. Ask yourself, why does Al-Qaeda tell its detainees to claim torture regardless of what happens to them in U.S. custody? Because Al-Qaeda knows that one of America's greatest weapons in this war is its reputation as a repository of freedom and decency. Our policy of permissible torture has handed Al-Qaeda this weapon to use against us. It is not just a moral tragedy, it is a pragmatic disaster. Why compound these crimes and errors by subsequently legalizing them as Krauthammer explicitly and the President implicitly are proposing? Will a ban on all cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment render interrogations useless? By no means. There are many techniques for gaining intelligence from detainees other than using their bodies against their souls. You can start with the 17 that appear in the Army Field Manual, tested by decades of armed conflict, only to be discarded by this administration with barely the blink of an eye. Isolation, psychological disorientation, intense questioning, and any number of other creative techniques are possible. Some of the most productive may well be those in which interrogators are so versed in Islamic theology and Islamic subculture that they win the confidence of prisoners and pry information out of them, something the United States, with its dearth of Arabic speakers, is unfortunately ill-equipped to do. Enemy combatants need not be accorded every privilege granted legitimate prisoners of war, but they must be treated as human beings. This means that in addition to physical torture, wanton abuse of their religious faith is out of bounds. No human freedom is meaningful without religious freedom. The fact that the Quran abuse has been documented at Guantanamo, that one prisoner at Abu Ghraib was forced to eat pork and drink liquor, that fake menstrual blood was used to disorient a strict Muslim prisoner at Guantanamo, these make winning the hearts and minds of moderate Muslims far harder. Such tactics have resulted in hunger strikes at Guantanamo, perhaps the ultimate sign that the coercive and abusive attempts to gain the cooperation of detainees has completely failed to achieve the desired results. The war on terrorism is, after all, a religious war in many senses. It is a war to defend the separation of church and state as critical to the existence of freedom, including religious freedom. It is a war to persuade the silent majority of Muslims that the West offers a better way, more decency, freedom, and humanity than the atrocities they live under and the totalitarian theocracies waiting in the wings. By endorsing torture on anyone, anywhere, for any reason, we help obliterate the very values we are trying to promote. You can see this contradiction in Krauthammer's own words. We are morally compelled to commit a terrible, monstrous thing. We are obliged to destroy the village in order to save it. We have to extinguish the most basic principle that defines America in order to save America. No, we don't. In order to retain fundamental American values, we have to banish from the United States the totalitarian impulse that is integral integral to every act of torture. We have to ensure that the virus of tyranny is never given an opening to infect the Constitution and replicate into something that corrupts as deeply as it wounds. We should mark the words of Ian Fishback, one of the heroes of this war. Will we confront danger and adversity in order to preserve our ideals, or will our courage and commitment to individual rights wither on the prospect of sacrifice? My response is simple. If we abandon our ideals in the face of adversity and aggression, then those ideals were never really in our